My story began a few months ago in one of the deforestation. At that time I had been working in the field of logging for quite a long time, about 15 years, but never in all that time had I encountered any difficulties other than the protests of rangers and locals. However, this time from the very beginning something went wrong as usual. Having received the technical task in the administration, together with 5 more of my colleagues, we moved to the forest area. Usually we cut down old and diseased trees, but this time the local furniture factory, which won the tender for the manufacture of furniture for the highest ranks of the administration, without any problems received permission to harvest forests in the nature protection zone of one of the forests located near our city, and considered protected. Naturally, the furniture company hired us to cut down trees selected in advance by their expert, whose trunks he marked with red paint. In general, the task is one of the simplest of all that could be thought up, because this time the volumes of cutting were not industrial. Our task was to cut down only 9 trees, but the payment was 3 times higher than even for the most difficult order. As it was written in the technical task, 4 pines, 2 oaks and 3 firs. According to our estimates, we had to meet somewhere in 10 to 11 hours, given the fact that the trees had to be cut down as carefully as possible, preferably in parts, as they do when cutting down a tree in the courtyard of a private house. We arrived at the place around 12 o'clock in the afternoon and immediately began preparations. Everyone wanted to finish their work as soon as possible and get home. We unloaded alpinist equipment, chainsaws, and slings, drove the Ural with a manipulator as close as possible to the first of the necessary trees and began to assess the scale of work on the spot. The first was a pine tree. There were absolutely no difficulties with it, and literally after 40 to 50 minutes it was dumped and already loaded onto a logging truck trailer attached to the Urals. The second was a birch tree. They took a little longer with it because of its remoteness from the road, but they finished about an hour later, half an hour. There were no problems with the rest of the pines and birches, of course, not taking into account the fact that the equipment periodically also freaked out. In total, we managed everything in about 6 hours. The first oddities began as soon as we approached one of the oaks. The machinery began to freak out abruptly, chainsaws did not want to start, axes and hammers jumped off the handles, trying to fly into someone's forehead. With grief in half, through swearing and swearing, we still started to complete the task. With oak, the work was going to be much longer and harder both in theory and physically. The oak itself is not the thinnest and softest tree, so it was also located in the middle of nowhere, 60 meters from the road. However, there is nothing to do, the order will not fulfill itself, they dragged themselves to the tree. The oak was nice, 3 or 4 meters in girth, it even became a pity to cut it down. However, after receiving a good slap from the boss, everyone trudged closer to the tree in order to start development. My duties in the group included laying and installing climbing equipment and instructing the team. With grief in half, we dumped and developed the first oak tree in a long and painful 3 hours. Who knew that furniture makers would choose such a giant? In order to drag the tree to the manipulator, the chief came up with a system of winches, hooking them onto the trunks of nearby trees, naturally causing them significant damage, tearing off the bark and damaging the structure of the trunk. However, most of the work was done. Cursing, we headed for the last of the trees. The time on the clock meanwhile was already approaching 11 a.m. We installed searchlights and gasped. He was a real king among the oaks. The tree is about 25 meters high. But there's nothing to do, we got to work. What was surprising was that the forest was silent. No, it was not quiet at night, the forest seemed to have died out altogether. There was no singing of night birds, no rustling of branches under the paws and hooves of animals. Nature seemed to have quieted down before the storm. I was distracted from my thoughts by the sound of a chainsaw starting. This time it started up without a hitch, and briskly crashed its sharp teeth into the bark of an ancient tree, strewing its base with sawdust. The man sawing the tree, whose name no one knew, everyone called him Petrovich, gradually walked around the tree in a circle, making a circular inscription, until at one point he stumbled over something and flew down cursing everything in the world. When we ran up to him, we saw the edge of a wooden box sticking out of the ground. Of course, everyone became terribly interested. What's inside, and not caring about the time, we began to dig up a wooden something. The longer we worked with shovels, the less what we took for a box looked like it. And when the wooden object was completely freed from the ground, we were horrified to see a huge coffin. Its dimensions were about 3 by 2 meters, and it was a mystery to us for whom it was intended. one of the most enterprising in our company, tore off the lid with a crowbar, and then everyone saw the body of a giant man lying inside. His face was covered with scars, long fangs protruding from under his upper lip, more like a wolf's. The man, if he could be called that, was covered with either brown or grey sparse fur. Everyone present, of course, was shocked to say the least, and for about 5 minutes they just stood and looked at this something. Of course, there was one single question brewing in the air, not yet voiced by anyone, but a very important one. What the hell is going on here? The coffin itself and the corpse lying inside looked very old. The boards were at least 300 years old. Over the years we have learned to determine the approximate age of the tree. We stood, smoked, pondered, but the foreman's sharp shout brought us all back to work. With an incomprehensible find, it was decided to sort it out tomorrow, but now it was necessary to complete the order and finally go home, because everyone was exhausted. But as soon as we took up the instrument, the forest, which had been silent before, suddenly filled with different sounds. The howling of wolves, the cries of birds, the call of foxes, all this mixed into one continuous cacophony, deafening and instilling fear in the hearts. Silhouettes of various animals began to flash between the trees. They seemed to surround the clearing where we were. It was no longer funny, and our group began to slowly retreat to the Urals. Meanwhile, the animals began to come out closer to the floodlit areas, and then we froze. Foxes, deer, wolves, hares, and even moose stood in one row on the edge of light and forest darkness. All this seemed somehow absurd, because these animals mostly conflicted with each other in nature, but now they stood silently and seemed to be waiting for something. The guys and I continued to slowly retreat to the Urals, which was the only island of safety in this forest, when suddenly the animals began to change rapidly in their appearance. The fangs and claws lengthened, the horns became sharper and took the form of rapiers, ready to pierce anyone they reach. There was a rustling near the tree and we were horrified to see how the giant, who had been lying in the coffin without signs of life, began to slowly rise, gradually getting out of the coffin. Not caring about everything, we rushed to the cab of the truck and jumped in one by one, locked all the doors. It is clear that this did not give us 100% protection from what was happening outside, but at least it was an opportunity to gain time. Our driver turned the key in the ignition and at the same moment, as if obeying an invisible order, all the animals rushed in our direction. The engine roared and the car crawled to the exit from the forest. The distraught animals tried to tear and gnaw the wheels, pierce them with horns and slash with claws, but the thick tires of the logging truck adequately held all attempts to pierce them. It even seemed to me that we were starting to break away. The end of the forest became visible ahead, beyond which the field opened. With our current speed, we will be on the highway in 5 minutes. Having calmed down more or less, I even allowed myself to let go of a couple of barbs against animals in a state of affectation, and at the same moment 3 huge trees fell 10 meters from the car, tightly blocking our way. From the shadow of the forest, that huge creature from the coffin appeared. It stood and grinned contentedly. Less than a minute later, the animals surrounded the car again. Naturally, based on the specifics of our work, there were always 2 to 3 guns and cartridges in the car, but at that moment no one had a thought about using them. The animals were unusual, and there were several hundred of them, and they all apparently obeyed that strange creature. Here the side window burst from a blow with a modified deer horn, here a hiss was heard outside, and apparently the animals bit the compressor hose. But strangely enough, then, everything suddenly quieted down, the animals retreated, and the strange creature opposite began to approach the car. The creature was standing about 4 meters from the Urals when sounds were heard from its mouth, from which the brain inflamed with fear could not immediately form words. The creature's voice was very low. "You have come to destroy the forest again. You people can only destroy. For centuries I have been watching your actions, and did not interfere when the forest was used for building houses, heating. Besides, your relatives, whom you call foresters, stopped the destruction of healthy trees. But now, your insides have rotted so much that you have started using the resources of nature not for survival, but for pleasure. I will not allow this anymore. Everyone from whose hands at least one tree has suffered, having entered the forest, will no longer come out of it." Then something growled and rushed to the car. With one strong jerk, it tore off the roof and began to pull people out of the cabin one by one. The first was the foreman. His creature simply tore into 2 parts, throwing them in different directions. The next was one of the operators of the manipulator. The creature clung to his throat, reveling in his blood. Waking up from confusion, everyone who remained in the cabin jumped out the door and ran in different directions, trying to escape. I and 2 others, namely one of the loggers and his assistant, rushed to the edge of the forest, trying to run out into the field. Turning around, I noticed how the second logger climbs under the Urals, apparently hoping to hide from the creature. A moment later, the creature is already turning over the heavy car, pulling the logger out from under it. I didn't want to see what would happen next, so I just turned away and continued running. Several deer appeared in front of us, one right on the move impaled the assistant logger on the horns, and lifting his head into the air, tore the poor fellow into several pieces. Apparently, there were 2 of us left alive, and there was only nothing to the edge, maybe 10 meters. And finally, we jumped out of the forest and stopped about 20 meters from the outskirts, turned around at an incomprehensible sound. Even before I turned around, I saw the trunk of a tree that we had cut down flying in our direction, which landed right on the logger who was running with me. The guy was flattened and pressed into the ground, the bones broke with a nasty crunch, and apparently all at once at the same time. Being in shock, I remained standing motionless, waiting for the second log that would be destined for me, but no, the seconds passed, and I was still alive. Glancing at the edge of the forest, I saw that it was filled with animals, and the creature stood on the edge between the field and the forest. Despite the great distance, I clearly heard the words of this creature: "You did not harm the forest, I will give you a chance. There is not a single ruined tree on your conscience, so you will stay alive. Get out of here." I did not challenge or ask any questions, and on the second breath that opened, I ran to the highway. Then everything is in a fog. A ride, a surprise driver, a police station, and then our office. I told everyone and everywhere the same thing. They say we were calmly chopping, when suddenly wild animals attacked us. Of course I didn't talk about any creature or a coffin under an oak tree. The next day, an investigative team went to the place of our work, where they wanted to take me as a witness, but I flatly refused. And only in the evening I realized why I was alive. Everyone who died somehow harmed the tree. Loggers understand this, but the operator of the manipulator loaded the dead tree, prepared it for transportation, and in fact stole from the owner of those places. The foreman helped the loggers, then someone else, and accordingly also destroyed the forest, but I was only engaged in insurance, and therefore remained alive. According to the results of the investigation concluded that my comrades were torn by wild animals, the roof of the car was torn off by a bear, and the car overturned due to the carelessness of the driver, who was in a hurry to get out as quickly as possible. The most interesting thing is that in the photos there was no hint of the presence of a coffin under an oak tree, and not the slightest trace. However, I had no doubt that everything that happened was real, and not my invention or psychosis. That night we woke up something really ancient and powerful, and mentally I dubbed this something the Master of the Forest Star. A lot of time has passed since then. I changed my job profile, moved to the city center, away from the forests and closer to the stone jungle, and I've been trying not to go into the forest since then, too. After all, suddenly that creature will change his mind, and therefore I would not like to meet him again.